Hello and welcome back to PsychoBible. I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and thanks for joining me. So, I'm going to be doing some videos on some really key experiences I had in 2018. The first one is I got to see Jonathan Pageau speak at St. Philip's Orthodox Church in Souderton, PA. So I've been following Jonathan and his YouTube channel for almost a year now, I think. So he got started on YouTube because he did a video with his brother Matthew with Jordan Peterson, as Jordan Peterson was doing his biblical lecture series, and he was approaching the story in Genesis of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he needed some help interpreting it. So he had these two brothers who were just pretty much experts on symbolism in Scripture and coming from the Orthodox tradition. And I really enjoyed that video. There's a lot of insight they provided. Unfortunately, I don't think Peterson used a lot of their insight, which was a bit of a shame, but they really did a good job explaining the meaning of that story. And so Jonathan went on and started his own YouTube channel where he goes into scripture and symbolic interpretations of art and culture and films. And so I've been following him and really enjoyed it. So I heard that I was following him on his Facebook page as well, and he announced back in April that he was going to be in Pennsylvania. Now this guy's in Canada. Like, what are the odds I'm going to be able to see him? And it was funny because he was going to be speaking at this Orthodox church in Souderton, which is about an hour away from me, maybe over an hour. And it was going to be on the same date that Newsboys was going to be playing in Newark. Was it Newark? Or Wilmington? I think Newark, Delaware. And Newsboys, it was the Newsboys United Tour, which they're my favorite band of all time, and particularly I'm a fan of the classic Newsboys with Peter Furler. And so it was going to be Peter Furler with Phil Joel and the originals, as well as Michael Tate. That was a tough decision to see Newsboys or this Orthodox icon-carver. So I chose Jonathan Pageau, and I do not regret it. Which, God blessed my choice, because later on the Newsboys circled back around later this year, and I got to see them up in Wilkes-Barre, PA in September. So that was my birthday gift instead. So what was really cool was I brought my video camera with me. I just bought it earlier this year, and I've been pumped. I'm like, you know what, I'm going to start making my YouTube channel, and whenever I go to speaking engagements, I'm going to film myself. And then I figured, you know what, maybe I'll film some Jonathan Pageau when I'm there, thinking that he would have his own camera crew since he's doing his own YouTube channel. But I show up at this church, and first time ever going to an Orthodox church, by the way. So this was also an experience for me on multiple levels. And I show up, and I ask someone at the door, hey, is it okay if I bring a camera? And he's like, sure, let me talk to the guy in charge. I speak with him, and he's like, yeah, you're going to videotape this? I'm like, well, yeah, if you guys let me. And turns out I was the only one there with a camcorder. So Jonathan later posted this video on his site, and he was using my footage. So I got to connect with him and send him the footage. And so it's my footage that I used. Unfortunately, I did not at the time have a large enough memory card, so I missed some of the footage from the Q&A time. So I had to switch over to my phone, and I was running out of space on that. So I missed one of the questions, but trust me, you're not missing anything. Sorry, lady. This one lady at the end was asking a question. I forget. I think it was about relics or something that didn't quite pertain to his talk. So he didn't really miss anything. So sorry if you're seeing this, whoever you are. So yeah, that was pretty cool. And then there was a Q&A time, and then there was a reception afterwards, so I got to meet some other people at the church, and some guy tried to convert me to Orthodoxy, and pretty much. But I got to sit at the table with Jonathan Pageau and a few others and have a really cool conversation with them, so I'm going to get into that as well. So what I'd like to do, I mean, you can see the whole video on his page, but I'm going to play some parts of his speech and give some commentary coming from a Christian counseling point of view, and just sort of a psychology and just some of my own thoughts. So here we go.
But I'm very curious about, as an artist and as someone who took on iconography and took on icon carving specifically, I'm always curious to see how the imagery in the icons, how it connects to the Bible, how it connects to liturgy, how it connects to the hymns, how it connects to the whole tradition of the church. But then, most of all, I'm always looking to see, how does it connect to our experience today? How does it connect to the world in which we live in? And so the title that Dr. Jenkins gave me for the talk is, I think it's Christ as the Center and the Principle of the Enchanted World. So that's actually, it can sound as something that's quite obscure. And so in order to talk about what it means, what are we talking about when we talk about the enchanted world, we have to understand even where that word kind of originated from. The notion of the enchanted world originated from its opposite, originated from thinkers like Friedrich Schiller and Max Weber, who talked about the disenchantment of the world. As Max Weber especially was looking at how the modern world was laying itself out, he was noticing how things were happening in the modern world. He was noticing that the world was being disenchanted, that the magic in the world was going away. That is, as the scientific thinking became more and more prominent, as we had more and more detailed mechanical, physical explanations for how things happen, the ancient spiritual reasons which were given, the ancient spiritual stories which undergirded the world, started to lose their power and to dissipate.
Now, one thing that was really cool about this talk was this is still fairly early on in his YouTube career, and this actually happened to be one of the videos that is one of his, I would say, one of his most important videos, because he really lays out one of his core arguments as he's been developing his series of videos on the symbolic world. This particular lecture, really, he used it to lay out some groundwork on his philosophy and theology of the world. So I got to not only just videotape one of his lectures, but it was also one, I would say, one of his most crucial lectures. So that was pretty cool. And this lecture is so critical for the current time in which we are living. In case you've been living under a rock, we're in the middle of a very crucial culture war right now. And I got into this a little bit with this class I'm teaching at my church. It's about masculinity, but I had to sort of lay out some of the current things going on with the culture. And what we're experiencing right now is a clash between modernism and postmodernism. And some would say, or Paul Vanderkleen, another YouTuber, he's a pastor, would say that what the culture war is right now is a civil war in Christendom. And it's interesting that he thinks of it that way, because what you're seeing with this clash between modernists and the postmodernists, okay, it's a battle over meaning in some ways, but both sides do not want the Christians involved. They're at least in agreement on this, that they do not want Christians having a say or having any real impact or influence in the outcome of this culture war. So the modernists, you even see this with what we're calling now the intellectual dark web, which is pretty much just a group, whoever decides who's part of this intellectual dark web, I don't know. I'm loving the content that they're all creating, but what you're seeing is it's a group of intellectuals and academics and scientists who are sick of the politically correct culture, and they want to be able to discuss openly and with some vigor some very difficult questions, and usually it's fundamental questions like the nature of reality and morality and existence, things of that nature. So you've got people like Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein and his brother Eric Weinstein and Dave Rubin, and like the only one in that whole group that is actually religious is Ben Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew. So there's no evangelicals at the table. There are no, there's certainly no creationists. There's, even if you want to include the old Earth creationists or intelligent design theorists like Hugh Ross or William Lane Craig, they're not at the table. So it's not that there's a lack of intellectual evangelicals or Christians, but you see that the intellectual world definitely wants to exclude them, so they're not welcome at the table right now. So it is interesting. It's a civil war within Christendom, but it's not involving many Christians. So what you're seeing is with this culture war, the modernists they're desperately holding on to the authority to determine reality and dictate what the nature of reality and also morality, which is interesting because most of your modernists are also pure naturalists and materialists. So I would say that the one who's probably most consistent with that view would be someone like Sam Harris, who believes we have no free will. Anyway, I'm probably going down a rabbit trail with this. So anyway, the modernists just believe that we can only determine reality through the scientific method, through what we can observe, test, experiment, measure, quantify, and just sees the world through facts. And we've long understood that there's a bit of a problem with that worldview in that it doesn't tell you, you can't, some would say, there's even some debate about this, but you can't arrive at morality through that method. So there's a debate about this, which is essentially, there's a debate between, or a series of discussions or debates between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris about this very topic, that you can't just arrive at a moral foundation or moral system through a worldview made of simply facts. There's too many facts. How are you going to choose which ones are significant and meaningful and which ones have value? And facts can't necessarily determine what you're meant to do and what has meaning and what has value and how you're meant to live. So we see that there's this crisis of meaning through a modernist worldview. So one solution to that is postmodernism, that just says, well, because there's too many points of view on this, then nothing has objective meaning. Instead, everyone's viewpoint is equally valid. But now you're seeing the marriage of postmodernism with neo-Marxism and says, no, not everything's of equal value, because some people have power and privilege, so they are using their power and privilege to promote their worldview over others. Therefore, not everyone is equal, or so we need to fight to make sure that all worldviews are equal. It just creates this system where you get more points if you are one of the, because you see there's another marriage between modernism or postmodernism and neo-Marxism with the identity politics. So the more you have identities that are not part of the mainstream or the dominant culture, then the more oppression points you get. So therefore you have more of a basis to try to silence the majority viewpoint or the dominant worldview. So it becomes this real bitter competition. So this is what's fascinating to me as someone who's just been watching all these videos and reading the discussion over the past couple of years, even prior to that with my experiences in graduate school, is how actually what happened is modernism paved the way to its own demise. Because of its rejection of a transcendent world and transcendent meaning, it paved the way for a postmodern rebellion or resistance to emerge from underneath. So that's what we're seeing right now. So with this lecture with Jonathan Pageau, he's going on an attack against the modernistic worldview that helped breed this plague of meaninglessness. And so his ultimate solution is that the solution to the disenchantment in the modernistic world is the Incarnation. So that's the crux of his discussion or lecture here.
See, in traditional societies, people are connected to transcendent realities. Those transcendent realities are undergirded by stories, by rituals, by identities, and those connections to transcendent realities are what give them their identity, are what make them give them their identity as individuals, but also their identity as groups, how the individuals come together, and then also identity through time. And we think that's obvious. Like we think it is not that obvious that, let's say, here in the United States, that whatever is here is somehow the same thing that was there when the founding fathers started it hundreds of years ago. There has to be a story which undergirds all of that together to make us continue to inhabit a space where those are the same. Right? And traditional societies, that's how they function. That's how they are connected together.
Now this section here that he just went into about identity, I think this is, it gets more and more relevant, not just with, the work I do as a therapist is constantly dealing with identity and how people view themselves. But he gets into something here that is so important, and that is what is the nature of identity? And I'm going to get into this more in some other videos in the future. But we tend, with the rise of postmodernism, they've hijacked the word identity to be something. It's kind of funny. They use it both in two different ways. One is through the neo-Marxists, what I was just explaining earlier with the identity politics, where you have multiple identities based on certain characteristics or groups that you belong to. And so that's actually more of an accurate definition of identity. But the other way that you'll see postmodernists use the word identity is that it's pretty much just not a social construct, but a personal construct. That it's something entirely subjective. And this is where you'll see more when it comes to the sexual identity crisis that we're in, where it's not just sexual identity, but now you can how you feel determines what you are. So it's an entirely subjective experience. And so we're seeing that first with sexual identity and gender identity, but why stop there? We're going into maybe you're identifying as someone who's disabled or an amputee, even though you have a completely intact and healthy body. Maybe you identify as a completely different ethnicity, even though you were born white. Or even more bizarre, which is going to become probably more commonplace, and people are going to have a hard... Like right now you can make fun of it, but it's going to come a time where you're not going to be able to make fun of this either. And that's with the people who identify as other species, other animals. So, you know, I identify as a leopard. You already had, I remember several years ago watching was it a woman? Or a man? The cat man. He's a tiger man. So he's done all this plastic surgery and crazy stuff to make his body resemble a tiger as much as possible. And we can look at that and think that's bizarre, but once you go into this world where identity is entirely subjective, it's just your inner experience, then you can do anything with it. So that's one way that postmodernism is using identity. But with modernism, we tend to understand that in order to have an identity, you have to have same traits as others. There has to be a collection of these traits that form an identity. And he gets into this with this lecture. There's something at the center that makes sense of all these seemingly disparate parts, and they come into a unified whole, and that's how you get an identity. So that's integrity, that's wholeness. So it's an important concept to get. That's important to understand when it comes to mental health. Having a secure identity is an integration of the different parts of your life. People who feel like they're pulled different directions, or they have this is a thing I've struggled with, where I have aspects of myself that look, it's demonstrated right here in my own bedroom. You have the comic books, you have my artwork, and then you have all my other books, my academic side, and my intellectual side, and my theological side, and philosophical side. And like I mentioned in my intro video to my channel, there was a temptation to try and make sure my camera only showed that side, and I just couldn't make it happen. And my wife was even trying to discourage showing the comics there, because, well, no one's going to see that and take you serious. So it's like those different sides of myself. It can split my identity, but I have to come to a point of accepting and integrating these different parts of me. That, hey, I'm an artist. I grew up on comics. I love stories. I love myths, which is why so much I really appreciate what Jonathan Pageau is doing is with explaining story and symbolism. And I love nonfiction. I love books. I love so much other stuff. So it's all a part of who I am. So seemingly disparate parts, they come together under a unified whole, which is me. So that's one aspect of identity. But you could even take something as simple as, say, a chair. What makes a chair a chair? There's different aspects to it. So there has to be a bare minimum of traits that make a chair a chair. It has to be some sort of flat surface that is elevated, which enables someone to sit on it. Does it have to have 3 legs? 4 legs? Not necessarily. Does it have to have a back? Not necessarily. So there's optional aspects to the identity, but they can get easily integrated and plugged into the main identity. so it becomes a type of chair. But if you were to have just the legs, but no bottom or no seat, it's not a chair. So you need to have, there's a certain amount of parts that we all know come together to make a chair a chair. So how do we know this is, that there's these things that make a thing? It's just that's how these parts get their meaning, when we know what the identity is. So let's continue.
So I'm supposed to talk about how the Incarnation is the center and the principle of this enchanted world. Maybe this enchanted world that we have lost. But in a way, to say that, to put those three together, the Incarnation, center, and principle, is maybe a tautological. We might actually be saying the same thing when we say those three things. The notion of a center is itself incarnational. It is a promise of the Incarnation. And it corresponds with its principle. And that's why such a brilliant saint, such as St. Maximus the Confessor, could take the notion of origin, of purpose, of meaning, and bring them all together in this vision of the Logos, in this vision, this expansion of this vision of the Logos which we find in the Gospel of St. John. And all of this is brought into the notion of the Logos and its incarnation into the world. And we have this notion that the Logi, that the Logi in the world, that these manifestations of Logos in the world are all gathered together, brought together into Christ. Christ is the summit and the center of all things. And then being the summit and the center of all things, as it comes back down into the world, Christ is the Logos and the origin of the world, the pattern which is hidden in the entire creation. You see, a center is by definition something around which things turn. Okay? Something, the center both defines space, but it also binds space together. If you think of it even in terms of geometry. Okay? It creates an identity. So in terms of geometry, the point, the center, is actually without measurement. It doesn't have, it is virtual, it is invisible, but it is the thing which holds a space together. It is the thing which binds a circle together. And that's why churches, temples, our rituals, they're concentric. We have the holy place towards which we all face, towards which we all turn. And that holy place, the altar, acts as center. And it acts as the point which defines the community of the Christian. It acts as the point which unites the community of Christians. You can go even farther. It's not just the altar, but it is the cup on the altar and the wine and the bread in the cup. You know, it is this concentric movement towards this now invisible mystery which is hidden in communion, and which is real and present, but which is a mystery. But just in general, we have these invisible identities which define us and bind us together. It's not only communion, it's not only church, but that's the shape of the world. We have these identities which define us. It can be our family. It can be our nation. And there are many of these identities, but these identities, invisible identities, act in a similar manner. They bind us together. And then we have these markers of these invisible identities. heroes, we have leaders, we have special cities, capitals, buildings, things which remind us of this invisible mystery which holds us together. So the center of something, right, there's something special about it. There's something which differentiates it from everything else, which holds it above everything else, which makes it qualitatively different from whatever it holds together. And in the thrust of disenchantment, right, in this movement that happened in modernity, this moving, this desire to destroy all superstition, we see this leveling of quality, this notion that everybody is the same, everybody is equal. Because in a material way, that is obviously true, right? I mean, a priest, in terms of his body, as in terms of his physical existence, is no different or no better than anybody else in the parish. And we see that, in kind of extreme, let's say, Anabaptist or kind of evangelical thinking, where it's like we're all the same. But the notion of the priest, or the notion of the center in general, is that something will be pulled up, will be made special, will be made to act as a center. And that is, it's an invisible quality. It's not, you can't measure it. Right? You can't measure a priest's priesthood.
So he mentions here about how with modernity there's a leveling of significance where everything's the same, everything's equal, there's no inherent meaning in things, and I think we're seeing the outcome of that that sort of doctrine that's been in our culture for so long, at least for the past, at least dominantly in the past 100 years, to the point where, all right, you can have religious meaning, but we ultimately know that that's not objective. That's a subjective thing. So more and more values get relegated to a subset of the culture, and to the point where that no longer has relevance. I hate using that term. To the rest of the culture, but it's not due to necessarily the fault of the standard bearers of that structure, the ones who are upholding the worldview that there's the enchanted world, the churches, the different religions, that the people of faith who believe that there is meaning in things. There's this talk about always the church has to be relevant. It's not necessarily up to the church to be relevant. It's the world, the society will determine what's relevant to it based on the trends in society. Our job is to remain the standard bearers and continue to point to what is truly relevant and what is truly meaningful, so that when the world, as it strays away from that center and realizes it went too far, will come back to the center at some point. We need to be faithful and stay grounded and stay pointed toward that center, toward what is truly meaningful, so that we are ready to receive the world when they're ready to come back. And that is what we're seeing right now, is this revival among atheists and agnostics and skeptics, who I think we're seeing the fruit of this worldview that there's no meaning in things. They're finding that there's a hunger for true meaning. And so, especially through Jordan Peterson and what he's been teaching, I'm seeing a shift in the culture right now, or at least in the world of academia and intelligentsia, Sometimes I can overblow it a bit because every now and then I talk to someone who has no idea who these people are, and it's a good reminder that it's still a subset of the culture that is aware of what's going on. So I'm hoping it'll spread enough that this will become more commonly understood. And but what I'm seeing though is there is a shift going on in the world of the agnostics and the atheists and skeptics. They're starting to question their fundamental beliefs, and they're starting to develop an interest in religion, in Christianity, in theism, and they're coming back toward the center. They're realizing the further they go into just a world of facts and just hard data, they're losing a connection to meaning. As Jonathan is saying, they're alienating themselves. So I think he's right on with this point. So as this leveling is happening, as we're being told more and more that it's pretty much being forced upon us that there is no meaning, nothing's more important than anything else. The reality is people don't buy it. They know that does not ring true. So the leveling is not working, and so what it's doing now is people are trying to find meaning in other things. This has been my culture in the 90s was the materialism. Literally, materialism as a worldview breeds materialism through consumerism and vanity, because you're going to try to find meaning through something, and if you only are told that the only thing that's real is the material world, then it's got to be meaning through other things, through money, through entertainment, travel, cars, and sex. It's all these physical things will be what we try to find our meaning in, and that's pretty much what the Bill Clinton era was all about. And then crisis hit us, and as a culture now we've been dealing with this nihilism with post 9/11, and well, what does everything mean? What's the value in anything? And now we're starting to come around to maybe we need to return to some roots. So as a culture, I've been seeing this happen in my own lifetime. So another thing is that we know that this just rings false. We want to find significance and meaning in the centers and the different identities. So what we're experiencing now is competition between the identities, where there's a desire to return back to a world of meaning. But as long as we do this with the rejection of Christianity and rejection of a genuine faith, we're just going to revert into some form of tribalism, a very base human, biologically driven desire to unite with people that are similar to us, just resorting to an identity that is ultimately kind of arbitrary, because identifying just based on some immutable characteristics, that's not very significant. But people want to identify with someone, with something, so that's what they're going to default to if we do not give them something transcendently meaningful. So yeah, what you're seeing now is as long as we keep Christianity pushed out, it's going to be on the fringe. We're going to duke it out between modernists and postmodernists without Christianity having any input and any influence. Then you're going to see us resorting to this tribalism, which is what's been happening with the rise of the alt-right. Though it's small now, the more it's going to be threatened, the stronger their numbers will be, or at least the more fanatical their tactics are. You see it on the left with the Antifa and just the rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, with the resist movement, with Trump and the stupid things he says. It's this going back to tribalism, uniting with people that seem similar to you, and that's where we're going to get our identity from. We're going to unite in that way. And as Christians, we know that it's not a game we want to play long term.
And so in this disenchantment, any center will start to appear as one more superstition. And it's a gradual breaking apart. And it's not necessarily done consciously, it just happens. It's a natural consequence of the modern world. We see this disenchantment everywhere. Right? Of course, we like I'm trying to explain to you, this notion of center can be taken analogically as any identity. But a good way to see the effect of disenchantment is to look at it in space. I mean, I'm an artist. I tend to think in terms of space. And so you can look at how society actually lays itself out on the ground, how it builds itself out. And you can see the disenchantment happening. So if you imagine, for example, a medieval town, right? How is a medieval town organized? You would have, in the center of the town, you would have a church. And the church would be the highest building in the town. So everybody from anywhere in the city, in the town, could look up and they could see the church as this central point. And then in the middle of the town, you would also have, an administrative building, the mayor's house or the mayor's building or whatever, and you would have a central place where people would come and could gather together and participate in things which would unite them as a town. Parades, any type of festivities, they would come and they would meet in the center of a town. And in the modern world, these types of structure, and on the edge, then you would have a wall, which would be the limit of what the identity of the town. This is the end of the town, which is identified by all of these things together. And the roads in the town would be concentric. If you look at a medieval town from above, it looks like a spider web. You have these roads which lead from the wall and move toward the center of town. Then you have these other roads that connect those concentric roads together. It looks like a spider web. So it is built by meaning. It is built by identity. Its actual layout is based on what gathers those people together. Now, in the modern world, this has slowly eroded. It took a while, but it slowly eroded. In the last few hundred years, we've seen it eroded until we've come to the suburban sprawl. I mean, what is exactly a suburban sprawl? These clumps of houses, this grid of houses, just no center. Nothing to bind it together. Nothing to hold it together. No church, no town square, nothing. Right? The last vestige of a town center is the shopping mall. That's the last vestige. And it can maybe show you this degrading of value. What it is that we turn around, the last thing left is the shopping mall. And even that is going to go away. It's going to disappear. Disenchantment will take its course. We can imagine a future very close by where people study online, work from home, shop online, and there is nothing to bring them together. There is no moment where they will come together. They are basically become independent points spread out on a surface, drips of paint thrown out on a canvas. They're basically a big Jackson Pollock painting. Do you know what Jackson Pollock painting is? I mean, who would have thought that Jackson Pollock was actually representing suburban America? I don't think you would have thought that. This is a form of alienation. This is an image of alienation. Of being ripped away from whatever it is that can bring us together, whatever it is that can give us common reason, common identity, common purpose. That is alienation. And alienation has been a common theme in modernity. Even the people who were for modernism, who were pushing early modernity could notice it happening. You know, you see commentators and the existentialists and people like that who talk constantly about modern man's alienation. They know that it's happening. And yeah, the suburban sprawl is the last phase of alienation.
So it's funny, he mentions Jackson Pollock, and that in our attempts to create our own identities and centers, our own centers, all across, that it turns into this giant Jackson Pollock painting. So in the reception time, at the table with Jonathan Pageau was this other guy who's, I don't know if he was an artist himself. I think he might have been. He was at least an art enthusiast. And so we got to talk about Jackson Pollock, and he's like, you know, people tend to think that the way he did his works was by just taking a bucket of paint and just throwing it at the canvas, and just however it landed, and that was random. But yeah, actually what he did was took spoonfuls of paint and went like this. And so that fascinated me, because that shows us that even in our desire to do something, to create something meaningless, we still can't do it randomly. That it has to be intentional, because there's some order, even if it's on an unconscious level, to the way that he would have flicked that paint with a spoon onto the canvas. It's not random. He may be a bit unaware of what the motivating force is within him to create the painting in that way, but there's something within him that is telling him what would be the most significant, what would be most meaningful, what would be salient, what would stand out, how much paint to put on this side, what color to use, how much to scoop and where to throw it. You cannot do it randomly. So as much as we want to take a meaning out of the world from a modernist point of view, and even the postmodern view that there is no objective meaning, there's still the pull within us. It's going to come out in some way. I just found that fascinating.
But there is a more profound, there is a more original alienation, which is at the core of all of this. And we can see it in terms of space as well. We can see it in terms of space. And this is where I'm going to take on the last 500 years of intellectual history. Just like a town was built concentrically, so too the entire cosmos was built concentrically. So too Earth, man looked up at the heavens and saw the spheres moving in the heavens and interpreted them that way. Saw them as moving around this center of meaning, which is man created in the image of God. That is how the world was built. And so the Copernican Revolution is a testimony to the very, very deep change that happened at that time. We often miss what that change was about. We're often presented with the Copernican Revolution as this notion that people used to mistakenly believe that the sun, revolved around the earth, and now we know, technically, that that is not the case, that in fact, the earth revolves around the sun. But that is not really what the Copernican Revolution is about. It was really about a move away from this enchanted, centered experience. It was a move away from seeing meaning as the organizing principle of the universe. Of seeing this notion of center, not only in terms of mechanical movement, but in terms of centers of meaning, centers of identity, as being the way that we look at the world and the way we one is, it might be difficult to grasp. I was actually expecting maybe a few people to get up and get out after I said that, but luckily that hasn't happened yet. You see, in order to even perceive, right, that the possibility of the earth turning around the sun, the change had to have already happened. There had been a very profound change in the way we see the world for that to be even possible to be posited. Because in order to be able to calculate that, right, Copernicus and Galileo had to alienate themselves. They had to alienate themselves. They had to project their mind to some imaginary point out there in space, and then imagine in their imagination at how these spheres were moving. It was a profound gesture of alienation. And it's important to talk about the Copernican Revolution. Why is it so important? It's so important because people keep talking about it today. People are always talking about it. It is one of the founding myths of the modern world is the Copernican Revolution. We hear materialist scientific types bring it up all the time as an example of a moment where religion was obscure and science was bright. We see it all the time. That's how it's presented to us. The truth is that there is absolutely nothing obvious. There is absolutely nothing obvious that change would happen. And that might seem strange to say, but I can show it to you quite easily. Because for some reason we've stopped there. For some reason we've stopped at a point where we say the earth is revolving around the sun. But that's not the end of it, is it? Right? That's not the end of that movement. We've moved quite further than that. In fact, with Einstein and general relativity, we have been told that all motion is based on points of reference. So it's not true that just that the earth is turning around the sun, right? So the earth is turning around the sun, and then the sun is turning around in the galaxy, and then the galaxy is moving away from other galaxies, and then the stars are all moving away from all the other stars. So let's try to figure that movement out in our minds now. But in order to, so we don't go there. We don't go there because once we get to the point that if we're going to calculate things only in terms of mechanical causation and mechanical movement, we should have to take up all these movements at the same time and also realize that the earth is turning around the sun relative to the sun, and the sun is moving away from the other stars relative to each other. Right? They're not actually moving in themselves. They're only moving in relationship to other things. That's Einstein's theory. That's general relativity. Right? And once we get there, why not? What point can we give in the universe to calculate all these movements? What point could we possibly give? Would it maybe make sense to give as a point of reference for all those movements, the one where we are making those calculations? Wouldn't it make sense to say that we're calculating all those movements from the earth? There's actually a priest, Paweł Florensky, who wrote an essay where he took the notions of general relativity to their extreme. And he said, okay, let's take general relativity seriously. And let's take it so seriously that we realize that the best position that we can take to make all those calculations would be from here, because this is where we are. I mean, it makes sense. We're the ones making the calculations, right? Let's make those calculations. And he did all the calculations, and those calculations end up being the same as Ptolemy made, 2,000 years ago. All right, so I'm playing a little bit of a game with you here. What's really important is to understand that we are the ones making those calculations. We are the ones not only making the calculations, but attributing value to those calculations. We are the ones saying that those movements, those values, those movements have meaning. And that is really the most important thing. What do the movements of the spheres, what do the movements of the planetary bodies mean? And now that's where the materialist type will say, no, those movements don't mean anything, right? They're just movements. They don't have meaning. But if someone tells you that they don't mean anything, you can right away see that the only way they can say that is to be completely alienated. Because obviously, the movements of the heavenly spheres have meaning. The day and the night are the structure by which we live our lives. The seasons, the waxing and waning of the moon, all of these movements of the celestial spheres, they are the patterns, they are the processions in which we exist. They are the movements in which we live our lives. Those are the ones that have meaning. And so once we start to view the world through these centers of meanings, all of a sudden everything changes. Now, I'm not saying that Galileo or Copernicus, that their calculations are technically wrong. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they were wrong in the calculations they were making. What I'm saying is that the real question is deeper than that. It's above those calculations. The real question is, what is the center of reality? What is more real? Right? Is it mechanical causation, or is it the world of meaning? Is it the world in which things are imbued with the meaning that they have in our lives? Which one of those is more real? Because one of them, the one where we say that the mechanical causation has more reality, brings about that alienation. The alienation that I've been talking about since the beginning. The very alienation that brought Copernicus and Galileo to project their mind outside of the world and look at the world from somewhere else. Right? We see that alienation all the time now. You hear someone, you see, especially when people are trying to study human beings, you see these scientific studies of a culture. You read anthropologists who think that they can stand outside of culture and that they can interpret culture. You meet some people who are studying consciousness and they somehow think that they can stand outside of consciousness and study consciousness. Or that they can stand outside of language and study language. We can't do that. We are living in the world. Right? We are embodied and we exist in the world. When we do that, we alienate ourselves. So, I wanted to paint a very dismal picture for you. But there is hope. There is hope. There is good news, because as I've already hinted so far, the world cannot become completely disenchanted, cannot become void of meaning. It is impossible. For the world to become void of meaning, the world would have to cease to exist. exist. And in the very experience of being, this enchantment, these sparks, these centers, they break through, and we experience, even though sometimes we're blind to it, we experience there is a path back to the magic garden. There is a path back to communion.
This is a crucial point. It is impossible for the world to become void of meaning. This is always something I bring up when I do, I try to bring up as much as I can when I have time in my lectures, is when I'm given a good chunk of time and I'm explaining things like sexual identity, I have to go back to basics, and that is that we are created by God, and God creates purposely and purposefully, meaning He created with intent. He meant to make things the way they are. It was not arbitrary. It was not accidental. That He meant to make it that way. But then deeper than that is He created purposefully, so that each thing also has a purpose. So it's not just he meant to make it that way. It's that not only did I meant to make it this way, and it has a purpose. So it's twofold. So because of that, then it means everything has meaning. We take that for granted. Now, how much meaning depends on how much something reflects the image of God. So, humans made in the image of God have the most meaning. You have more meaning than anything else in the world. You may never fully realize it. The most beautiful sunset still does not have as much meaning as you do. So, for the world to stop having meaning, it would have to cease existing. If it exists, it has meaning, because God created it on purpose and for a purpose. Such an important point.
So I tried to find some very practical examples, these moments where these sparks shine for us. There's plenty of them. But I want you to imagine a cup. Your grandmother gave you this cup. And she gave you this cup because it was a special cup. Because when you were young and you went to your grandmother's house, this would be the cup that you would use. So before she passed away, your grandmother, she gave you this cup. So you put the cup in your cupboard, right? And it becomes your favorite cup. So when you open the cupboard, that cup, it shines, right? It's brighter, right? It's golden. I mean, it doesn't physically glow. There isn't a lamp inside the cup. But it's the best way to describe that experience of that cup. When you open the cupboard, it is the first cup you will see. And even without thinking about it, it's the first cup that you'll reach for. Right? And the shine, the glow of that cup, it's not just in the cup. It's not physically in the cup, but it is in the story, in the memory, in the history of that cup, in you, in communion with that cup. It is as you enter into communion with that cup will shine. Now, if any other stranger opens the cupboard, they look at the cup, they don't see that, right? They don't see that. But it is real. It is real. The other example that I have that I think is to me the most immediate is recognizing someone. There is a difference in your experience experience between someone you don't know and someone you know. You're standing in a bus, and there is a crowd of people in the bus. And all those faces, they are somehow dim. I mean, they're faces, they're people, but there is a way that we perceive strangers, which is different from the way that we perceive the people we know. Now, if someone you know walks into the bus, all of a sudden, that person will shine. There's no other way to say it. That person will pop out, and you will see that person. Your eyes will go to that person. And all through, as they're walking through these dim faces, it is that face which will glow in the bus. That is a real experience. I've experienced, you can experience it sometimes, you can experience it directly. You're standing in front of somebody, and a person is talking to you, and you don't know the person. And they're talking to you. You're talking to them, and you're nice, and you're kind, and you're being polite. And then all of a sudden, the person says something that makes you realize that, no, wait, I know this person. If you've ever experienced it, their face will change before your very eyes. The way that you see them will transform. And all of a sudden, from that stranger, you see this face of this person. You know this person with whom you are in communion. Now, I've used the personal examples because they're the ones that are the easiest to understand, because they're the ones that make it into our own little experience. Even the most secular atheists of us will experience these small moments where the world becomes magical. But this hierarchy is real. It is how the world works. You see, there are too many things in the world. There are too many details. There are too many facts. There are too many aspects to things. And so it is inevitable, it is inescapable that certain things, certain stories, certain images will be more enchanting. There's no way around it, that they will become more meaningful than the others. Or else you couldn't see anything. There is an indefinite amount of details in this one leaf right here of this plant. I could spend an hour describing every curve, every line, every aspect of this one leaf. The world is so full of details. It fragments into chaos. It moves out and becomes the sand. So it is inevitable that we have to engage the world in this magical way. There's no way around it. That's how reality works. Now, in a similar way that my favorite cup shines, and although at another level, a level which is more encompassing, which is grander, which is higher, but still it's the same pattern. The cup which is used in church, the cup which is on the altar, is sacred. It is really sacred. It is sacred. It is sacred because it has been put aside, because it stands apart, because it has been focused, it has been set aside for communion, for the communion of the faithful. And it is with that cup that we all come together and we stand and we approach that cup. All of that is real. That cup is sacred. And so a Dawkins, atheist type, will probably retort something like, it's all good and nice. This is all nice because you're talking about subjective things, you're talking about human things, but that is not the case for objective science, right? That's not how science works. That's how we engage with things, but that's not how science works. But once again, that shows the profound alienation. And once again, one forgets their own embodiment, their own embodied experience. This process of the center is as true for science as it is for our engagement with the cup that our grandmother gave us in the cupboard.
Now he gets into how there's too many facts in the world for none of them to have meaning. And this is so relevant, especially to the type of work he does as an icon carver, an Orthodox icon carver who practices within the medieval tradition. Okay, if you know about artwork and art history, you'll know there's a big difference between medieval art and Renaissance art. Renaissance both reflect the worldview in which they were made, at the time of which they were made. With medieval art, you'll notice the characters are not necessarily in proportion. You'll see an emphasis on the eyes. The faces look a little more elongated, and their eyes are wider. And as a kid, I would see medieval art and think, did they just suck? Were they not very good at drawing? And but no, there's a purpose to it. They're not creating to match reality, but to match. Depends on what you mean by reality. They're not creating in order to match the physical reality, but in order to match the reality of the world of meaning and value. So things are bigger if they have more significance, not necessarily if they are closer, like we would if we're thinking perspective. It's about this. The significance of something determines the size of something. That's primary over the physical dimensions and realism. So then as the culture started to change and the worldview started to change to start to value more the material world, the art began to reflect that, and that became the Renaissance period, where now a focus became on matching reality, the physical world, as much as possible. So, whereas before, in medieval art, you don't pay attention to every single detail. If you were to draw a face, do a portrait of someone, you're drawing just a few core aspects. It's like a caricature, except it's not goofy looking or not meant to be humorous looking. It's just what are the most salient, most meaningful parts. But a Renaissance painter is going to try to get every single hair, every wrinkle, every detail, and still capture their essence, which is amazing when they can do that. But the emphasis is on every part. Every detail has meaning, and it's so that there is no ultimate meaning. It's now when we're looking at realistic art, which it's fascinating. Who doesn't appreciate an artist who can make something look like a photograph or like the real thing? It is amazing. And so I would say because of that emphasis, that supreme value put on matching the physical reality, that helped drive people's development in their skills to match this reality. So that maybe, a Renaissance painter is more talented and skilled at their craft than a medieval painter. But does not mean that the medieval painter was entirely incapable of matching reality. Their focus, though, is on different reality. So with the Orthodox tradition, they are trying to preserve that medieval sort of worldview. Because I used to wonder, like, okay, if you're going to do icon artwork, like, why does it always have to look like it's still medieval? Why can't it be in a modern way? Why can't you make symbolic artwork using a modern art style? And I can understand now where he's coming from. Um, so yeah, the trends in artwork are a reflection of the values of the culture and the artist, of course. Which in the comic book world, you're seeing this. There's a shift going on as well. So, in comics, it wasn't always meant to look realistic. It was meant to look flashy and fun and sexy and just appealing and bright. And then there's this trend in the early 2000s. You saw a real shift in the artwork that was predominant in through most of the artwork in the comics post 9/11 was now a new emphasis on realistic artwork. They wanted to match the grittiness, the darkness that we were experiencing in the world. So in the early 2000s, yeah, gone were the days of artwork that really popped. And there's still some artists that still have that style, but the main type of art that was really being put in the major titles was this sort of realistic looking type of art, and some of it just was kind of bland. Not my favorite era. That started to change. Some really good artists started rising to the top. But now what's going on is postmodernism and neo-Marxism rising in the comic book world as well. The identity politics, and you're seeing this type of artwork that looks, it's not looking realistic, and it's not looking fun or flashy or like typically like comic book style. It's now looking like clip art, or people say like Steven Universe, like some of this artwork that you see on Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon these days. It's like cookie cutter artwork. You're seeing that pass. I would never see that in a comic book 20 years ago. At least not in a Marvel or a DC comic. So I'm barely buying the newer comics if it has that type of artwork in it. So it's a reflection of the current culture where everything's a joke. We're not going to take it serious. Even the way they make the characters talk. So it's an overthrow of the structure, the value structure that dominated the comic book world for decades since its inception. So that who cares about this? The characters don't need to look cool. They don't need to look tough. They don't need to be doing dynamic poses or saying heroic things, or it's like they're doing this. Artists who are used to doing these slice of life comics are now doing our superhero comics, and there's a bit of a backlash. Numbers are going way down, so they're paying the price for that. Anyway, side rant.
I told you, there are too many facts. There are too many facts in the world. There are too many aspects of the world. The world is too big. The world moves towards this infinite, this indefinite chaos. So there must necessarily be a way for special facts to stand out. Now, when you do a scientific experiment, you have a theory. And that theory, what does it do? It makes certain facts shine. It makes certain facts glow. Because it becomes the center around which facts are organized. If I'm studying fungus, the facts that I will see are the facts that are related to fungus. I will not spend my time describing the facts that talk about cosmological principles. Right? I will focus on the facts which prove or disprove my theory. The facts will appear as, sorry to use the word, but they will be something like sacred in the context of that scientific experiment, in the context of that scientific theory. And I will even organize the facts in a hierarchy of facts. And there are certain facts which scientists they call them outliers, because they don't totally fit with what the other facts related to this theory are saying. And they will leave those facts aside. Those facts will be more dim. They won't shine as brightly as the ones which are right there, right in the right place to either prove or disprove my theory.
This is something that Jordan Peterson talks a lot about, and that without an aim, you cannot even perceive the world. That once you pick a point of reference, or you have a purpose in what you're looking for, then the world now presents itself to you, and you can perceive things that now have meaning to you ignore things that are you're not even looking for, and things that have to do with what your aim is now come into focus. They have salience, which is a word. There's a couple of times in this lecture that Jonathan is doing where he's grasping for a word, and the word is salient or salience, depending on what he's saying at the time. And that is where things really stand out, and they have influence and impact and meaning to you. So it's really how our brain even perceives things, is based on what is it looking for. So yeah, Jordan Peterson goes into this in his lectures, and he mentions it frequently, that you can't even think, you can't even make decisions until you have a direction of some sort. It may not be the best direction, it may not be the wisest choice, but you gotta pick something and start moving. And gosh, ties together with this class I'm teaching at my church right now on masculinity, is one of the core capacities of manhood is to move. And for men, it's to sit still and wait, to be complacent, to be passive. That is our greatest sin. And so there's sometimes where we hold ourselves back until we know exactly what we're meant to do. But sometimes you don't know what you're meant to do until you start to move. So pick a direction. As long as it's within the realm of what God allows. At least have an aim. And as you progress toward it, the aim will adjust. And you'll make some mistakes. And that's okay. You're allowed to make some mistakes. You'll adjust your aim. And you realize, okay, maybe that wasn't for me. But you cannot even perceive the world. You can't even see what matters until you have an idea of what is meaningful to you. It's so important to understand.
Now, I keep talking about this notion of the center, right? Of this mysterious qualitative difference, in something which makes it stand out in a way, or at least makes it stand apart and acts as I call it an anchor in the world. And this vision, I would say, we could call that an incarnational vision of the world. I don't think there's anything weird about saying that. You see, the world is a place where these sparks, where these meanings, where these centers, these essences organize all of these far too random effects, gathers this multiplicity, from this multiplicity gathers them together into these possible unities, into these unified beings. All beings have parts, right? So a cup has parts. Why do we think that those things come together and make one thing? A cup has a handle, it has this. What is it that makes it bring it together and say that it is one thing. The United States is hundreds of millions of people on a vast, vast land. Why do we think that this is one thing? What makes us say that this vast sprawl of people on a vast, vast land is one thing? Right? That's what essences do. They gather things together. And the pattern for this is set. It is set there already in the book of Genesis. We find God who gathers the dust, gathers it into a body, and then blows the spirit into that body. And that is how we have man. We have the notion that Christ gathers the lost sheep, gathers the sheep, brings them together into one body, and blows his spirit. Right? Creating one church. And so too, the mystics will tell us to gather yourself into your heart. Because you also have all these parts. You have all these thoughts. You have all these desires. You have all these passions, which could pull you in all these directions, away from the center, away from the thing that makes you in the image of God, that makes you in the image of Christ. And the mystic tells us to pull all that together, to enter into the heart, so we can encounter and become like Christ. Right? And even just our experience of consciousness, just our experience of being a locus, where all of these sensations, all of these things that we see, all of these people are gathered into one person that holds that together and makes out of all this multiplicity one thing. All of that is following the same pattern. And then by analogy, we quickly realize that that is also the structure of all the things I talked about before. It's the same structure as a functioning town. It's the same structure as a family, as a country. It's the same thing as a church.
Now, Jesus, as the Incarnation, he is the ultimate center. He is the ultimate unifying principle. And we see this, as he mentions, this theme throughout the Gospels, and that he is the shepherd. He gathers the lost sheep, or just the sheep that belong to him. He gathers them to himself. And when he is your center, then he gives you a unified identity, not just corporately as a church. He becomes what unites us all, the true followers of Christ. But also individually, this is where the concept within a counseling setting comes in, where I help clients, who are at least believers, to understand their identity in Christ, that he becomes the central point of their life, the unifying principle in their life, the filter through which they see and perceive things, and through which they determine what their values and their goals are. And this unifies the different parts of themselves, and it gives them a sense of the meaning within themselves. And as we become more unified as believers through the body, and also within ourselves, as we become more whole, then we become more like Christ. We participate in his glory, and we reflect him in his nature more and more. So that's why it's so key to understand how Christ is that unifying principle. If we are made as humans to reflect the image of God, and Jesus, the Messiah, the Anointed One, is the perfect image of God, then if we make him the central focus of our lives, we make him our center, we will then ultimately fulfill our original calling to be the images of God.
I'm going to posit something to you and see how you respond. If one doesn't center themselves in Christ, I think perhaps the center becomes themselves, right? So everyone is given certain gifts that God, everyone's unique and they have their own special gifts, right? And traits. And so if you center yourself around yourself, then, as you say, we have filters, kind of a filter, I think it's a pre-thought filter, that we have feelings for things. If you're centered on Christ, you have a feeling for something that points to Christ, for instance. If you have something that I think you still have a feeling for things, because you have to filter things out, right? So you have a feeling for things, and through this pre-thought feeling, you accept or reject things that come at you, or transform them into something that you find pleasing, that pleases the center. So you're kind of enchanted, one is enchanted with themselves, and their feelings become kind of corrupted as they are.
Yeah, I think that sounds absolutely right. I think that sounds as when it's often described as being if you're possessed by a passion, especially pride. Obviously, it's the first passion. That's what it is. And when I talk about the story of Christ as being the ultimate version of that, and that's where you can see that for Christ to be the incarnation, right there, he had to die, and he tells us to take up our cross. And I think that in order to, and this notion of entering into the heart, entering into your heart, it happens through this removal of the garments of skin, as the fathers talk about, as this sacrificing of our passions and of our little idiosyncrasies that we hold on to so much. So I think what you said is quite right.
I love this guy's question in the Q&A time. If you can't hear the audio very well, here's pretty much what he was saying. So with this idea that you must center yourself around Christ. If one doesn't do this, then the center becomes self. Now, everyone has unique gifts, and such as we have these pre-thought filters, such as our feelings and our intuitions. And if we're centered around Christ, then we have feelings that will point us, intuitions that will point us toward Christ. So this guy, I love this comment, because he was able to hear everything Jonathan was saying and integrate all these different parts. So he was integrating this stuff about how you can't, you need to have an idea of meaning in order to even perceive the world, okay? Combined with how Christ needs to be the center. So when he is your center, he is the source of meaning, then your feelings, your intuitions, your thoughts will point toward Christ. Okay, and that glorifies him. However, so let me backtrack. So then you will accept or reject things you encounter based on those pre-thought feelings. So if Christ is not the center and you are instead, you become enchanted with yourself. And your feelings become corrupted because they're all about glorifying you. But you're not able to really contain the glory that our feelings are pointing toward, and that we want to bestow upon ourselves. You can't contain that. So the praise that we have within us toward what's infinite can't be pointed towards something finite. So, and Jonathan agreed. It's like this is the first passion of which is pride. So for Christ to be the incarnation, he had to die. He had to surrender, as we see in Philippians, that Christ, when he came to earth, humbled himself. So that is it's essential for us to have humility as our starting point. That's the only way we can then have Christ as the center. If we're still holding on to our pride, Christ will not become the center. We will. So we have to sacrifice our fleshly passions and our idiosyncrasies and remove the garments of flesh, that, as Jonathan was saying. So that's the gist of that comment. And I went up to that guy afterwards and just shared with him how much I really appreciated his comment. He was so humble about it too. So he's living out this principle. He was thinking, well, I'm not sure if I made much sense. I'm like, no, you made perfect sense. That was a very profound point. So I love that.
So I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years reading James K. A. Smith's How Not to Be Secular. Are you familiar with that work?
I have not read it.
So it's essentially kind of a popular presentation and then somewhat a response to Charles Taylor's massive secular age.
Right.
And one of the things that, I haven't read Taylor's book, maybe some, but one of the things that he says in there is, we're now at a point in history and culture where, and you kind of alluded to this, which is what made me think about it, where our daily experience of the world is so immanentized, it's so material, that it's hard for us to even conceive of a different way of experiencing it. It's not plausible, right? And he says that the difference between the way that, and he's talking about specifically about Christianity, Christian can live within this, though, versus someone who essentially says that the material is all there is what Taylor calls the difference between an open take on reality versus a closed take on reality. And at least the connection that I made as you were speaking was, you're talking about paying attention to certain facts and not others. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that this idea of open take is really about where do you choose to put your attention.
Yeah.
If you decide there is nothing transcendent, then you're not going to see it.
Yeah. And it's, you read in the Fathers when they tell you things like not to judge others. That has to do with that idea that you engage the world with a certain perception where you're not out looking for the other person's fault, because you can find them. Everybody has them, right? Everybody has a fault. We can spend our time nitpicking at everybody's faults, but to engage the world in a way where you have this open generosity towards others, where you're looking for Christ in that person, right? That's what you're searching for when you engage them. And that, that's what you said, then you end up paying attention to certain facts. You end up looking at that person through a certain lens, and that will transform the way you engage the world.
The other comment in the Q&A was from one of the priests there at the church, and he was bringing up this one book he was reading, and he was going into along these lines of our perceptions, that if our daily experience of the world is so material, we can't conceive of a different way of experiencing the world. It's not plausible to us. So we have either an open take or a closed take on reality. And it depends on where you choose to put your attention. Like I've been saying, where's your focus? What is your goal? What is your direction? And that is how the world will present itself to you. So if you decide de facto that there's nothing transcendent, then you won't even see it. So that was another good point you brought up. And I like how Jonathan commented on that. He could have went the easy route, which would be, see the stupid atheists and materialists. But I like what he added to it was a caution against judging others because of the way you engage the world. because of the perception in which you engage the world. And the admonition was to look for Christ in each person. It affects how you engage the world and the facts you see about the person. When I'm looking for Christ, so this, once again, is another application of making Christ the center. He's not just the center of my life, but he's the center of all life. And so I'm going to look for Christ in all things, in all people. Even the most depraved person. If I have this lens on, then God will help me to see that person through his eyes and see, even if it's just a glimmer, even if it's distorted and through sin and depravity, but to see the imago Dei, the image of God in that person. And that's how I can move past the tribalism through, to sort of tie things together, like I was saying before, with this cultural war we're in, with the modernists versus the postmodernists, and there's just this polarity is increasing, and they have their camps and they're fighting amongst each other and trying to disprove each other, or just shout down each other, overpower each other. What is a Christian response? Is to see the image of God in each of these people. And whether you're in the middle, or if you're one end of the extreme or the other, it doesn't matter. Each of the actors in this whole struggle has some aspect of the image of God in them. They have some dignity, despite their depravity. So crucial. So, like I said earlier, at the end we had a reception. There was food and drinks. And first time ever going to an Orthodox church. So this was a unique experience, because I don't think I've ever been to a church gathering where you had wine and other spirits there for consumption. Like, that was unique. I don't drink, so I just had soda. And there's barely any non-alcoholic beverages to drink, so that was interesting. But I got talking to a couple other guys before I was able to sit at the same table with Jonathan and a couple others. And one guy was pretty much just trying to convert me to Orthodoxy. And I'm just a curious person. I just wanted to learn more about their worldview and their tradition, because up until Jonathan Pageau, when I started following him on YouTube, I really didn't know a whole lot about the Orthodox Church. It was always the church that I was curious about, but you don't really get to meet, at least in North America, or I guess, yeah, in North America in general, but I would say especially in the United States. You don't really get to meet many people who are Orthodox, and they're not very evangelistic, or at least going around trying to convert people to them. I mean, from what I've been hearing more and more, is that they are very rigorous with their conversion, or their initiation, whatever. The process of becoming a member of their church is very stringent. So there's some wisdom to that, of course. But when I started encountering Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson, who really has shown an affinity toward the Orthodox tradition as well, I guess because of his association and friendship with Jonathan. So I've been exposed a little more to their tradition, and I really appreciate their appreciation. I appreciate their appreciation for the symbolic, and I can appreciate that as someone from the Pentecostal or charismatic tradition. We don't have as rich a history as the Orthodox Church, but we do value the symbolic. Any Pentecostal or charismatic preacher worth their salt will look to, say, the Old Testament as types and shadows, and see the symbolism in the names and the of the people, of the cities, of the nations, especially those involved in the battles against the Israelites, of the different people in the stories. There's significance in the names. There's significance in numbers and in directions, the way people are going. Are they traveling up? Are they traveling down? There's all these spiritual parallels. So we have an appreciation within the charismatic and Pentecostal movement for symbolism as well. The guy I was speaking there didn't quite grasp that. He's still, because we didn't have the church fathers that we consult as much as them, just didn't see that as being a parallel. I was just sort of saying that it's like, well, because it's like he was trying to explain that they have the market on symbolism. And I'm like, well, not quite. In my tradition, we also value symbolism. You guys to a certain extent that I don't think we have. So that's why I really appreciate learning from Jonathan's videos. But it's not enough to make me convert necessarily. I'm quite content with being non-denominational. So, but then I got a chance to sit with Jonathan and a couple others, and there's a priest there who was talking for quite a while about a pilgrimage he went on and relics. So it's a really interesting conversation, or peculiar to me, I guess, foreign at least I could say that. So I didn't get to really talk to him one-on-one as much, but I did get a moment, and there's a question I've been wanting to ask him for a while, so I took the opportunity to ask him, because in other videos he mentioned how he used to live in Africa and work with, I forget which nation it was. I don't want to say it if it's wrong, but he was working with artisans there and helping them get businesses started, and that's actually where he really got started with carving, because before that he was more of a painter, and he learned carving, or started practicing carving more there in Africa, and learning from them their symbols. And he said before that their shapes are their symbolic language. So he mentioned that in one of his previous videos, and so I was really curious about that. And so I brought that up to him. You had mentioned before how the tribe you're with, that the shapes had symbolic meaning, and so I was curious, what were some of those symbolisms? So he shared a couple of them, because I'm always curious to see how universal symbols are, even if it's just in the matter of a shape and not just a picture of a person, or just fascinated with the universality of our symbols. And so say if a design had a square, which represents like a closed space, that represent containment, and particularly for people who were insane. And he was mentioning how there's in their culture, the way they would treat someone who was mentally unstable would be they would attach something heavy, like say an engine, a car engine, and they'd be chained to it, so they can't run away. They're on a leash, but it still provides them with a certain degree of mobility. They just have to pick up their engine and walk around. And that's a fascinating concept. They can still be in the community. They're not isolated, but at the same time, they're not totally free. But they still get to associate with people. So that would be the containment. And then if there was like a square or some sort of shape like a square that was open on one end, then that represent like a bird being set free, which would represent freedom. So fascinating that in the patterns and the shapes, there's story. So once again, there's meaning in everything. Can't escape it. If it exists, it has meaning. All right. Thank you for sticking around for my ramblings and my musings on this talk. And I mean, if you check out his full video, it's already pretty long. So my commentary just made it even longer. So I chopped it up quite a bit. So I encourage you, please check out the rest of his video and his other content. So, and if you have your own musings, well, comment on his, as that's probably the better place. But If you have some thoughts about my thoughts, comment here as well. And click that like button, subscribe, be in touch. God bless.